comunidade brasileira do ensino de história, olá, associados da Associação Brasileira de Ensino de História. É um prazer ter todo mundo aqui nessa entrevista com o professor Wayne Ross, da Universidade da Colômbia Britânica. Eu vou fazer uma breve apresentação e aí nós vamos passar diretamente para as perguntas. Nós estamos aqui em três membros da associação, né? Eu sou o professor Luiz Serri, sou ex-presidente da ABEH. Estamos também com a professora Maria Lima, que é a atual presidente da Associação Brasileira de Ensino de História e que é professora da Universidade Federal do Mato Grosso do Sul, e também com a professora Juliana Andrade, que já foi da diretoria da associação, que é professora atualmente da Universidade Federal Rural de Pernambuco, né? Então, esse vai ser a nossa equipe de perguntadores, e nós estamos também com perguntas que foram feitas por outros associados, né, no grupo de WhatsApp do chamado Conselhão da ABEH, para fazer para o professor Wayne. O professor Wayne Ross é professor no Departamento de Currículo e Pedagogia e co-diretor do Instituto de Estudos Críticos da Educação na Universidade da Colômbia Britânica, em Vancouver, no Canadá. Antes de se juntar ao corpo docente da UBC em 2004, foi Distinguished University Scholar e presidente do Departamento de Ensino e Aprendizagem da Universidade de Louisville. Também ensinou estudos curriculares e educação em estudos sociais como membro do corpo docente da Universidade Estadual de Nova York, nos campi de Albany e Binghamton, e na Universidade Estadual de Ohio. Foi professor visitante na Universidade de Victoria, na Universidade de Lewis e, nos anos 90, na Universidade de British Columbia. Ross obteve seu doutoramento em Currículo e Desenvolvimento Instrucional na Universidade Estatal de Ohio, onde escreveu sua dissertação sobre a socialização profissional de professores secundários de estudos sociais. Obteve uma licenciatura em Educação e um mestrado em Ensino, História, na Universidade da Carolina do Norte, em Chapel Hill. Começou sua carreira na educação como funcionário de uma creche na Carolina do Norte e depois como professor secundário de estudos sociais em Atlanta, na Geórgia. O professor publicou mais de 20 livros e mais de 200 artigos, capítulos de livros, ensaios e resenhas sobre estudos curriculares, educação em estudos sociais, formação de professores e pedagogia crítica. O Dr. Ross interessa-se pela influência dos contextos sociais e institucionais na prática dos professores, bem como pelo papel do currículo e do ensino na construção de uma sociedade democrática face aos impulsos antidemocráticos da ganância, do individualismo e da intolerância. Nos últimos anos, tem analisado a influência dos movimentos nas normas educativas e dos testes de alto risco no currículo e no ensino. Ross é cofundador do The Rouge Forum, um grupo de educadores, pais, estudantes e ativistas comunitários que lutam por uma sociedade democrática. O Rouge Forum organiza uma conferência nacional anual e vários encontros regionais sobre um vasto leque de questões de educação para a justiça social, incluindo educação democrática, letramento crítico, resistência à educação estandardizada e aos testes padronizados de larga escala, reforma da educação corporativa, educação inclusiva, educação antirracista, comercialização das escolas, guerra e militarização das escolas. Então, vocês podem ver, né, ele já foi o nosso conferencista do encontro de pesquisadores do ensino de história lá na Universidade Federal Rural de Pernambuco, que foi o evento que foi coordenado pela professora Juliana. Nós já tivemos ali uma primeira apresentação e pela apresentação vocês já perceberam, né, as possibilidades de contribuição que o professor Ross traz para a nossa comunidade, dada aí a semelhança, né, dos contextos e das situações da influência do neoliberalismo sobre a educação brasileira, que é também uma característica mundial. Thank you very much, Professor Ross, for being with us. And we'll start by doing the first question. But if you want to make your salutation to the group, it's okay.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm very pleased to participate in this conversation today, and was very pleased to participate in the book and the conference produced by the association.
Ok, então nós vamos para a primeira pergunta, para question number one. A primeira pergunta é: como se deu a sua opção por estudar o ensino das ciências sociais? Fale-nos um pouco sobre a relação entre a sua trajetória pessoal e profissional. Enfim, como era o Wayne estudante?
I studied. When I went to university. I was quite interested in studying psychology, as many beginning university students are. But I ended up also studying social sciences and history in particular, and took my degree in actually in teaching social sciences or social studies education, as it's called in the United States. Um, I did not envision myself as becoming an academic historian, though, and that's why I chose the teaching route. But my mentor, as a university student, as an undergraduate university student, encouraged me to go to graduate school. And in graduate school, I discovered critical social theory, critical perspectives on social science, and I just delved into that. And
Mhm.
I always thought I was going to go back and teach high school, which I did in the United States, but ended up staying in the university. In terms of my personal connections, my personal professional um, life connections, there were two really profound things I think that have shaped my professional thinking that are related to my personal life. And the first was growing up in the southern United States in the 1960s and 70s, where even though racial segregation was, and particularly in schools, was supposedly uh, a reality, according to Brown versus Board of Education, the famous desegregation decision of the U.S. Supreme Court. My daily life in South Carolina and North Carolina as a young person was marked by severe racial segregation in schools, in public transportation, in every aspect of life. And these things, I think, were had a profound effect on me, particularly as I became an adolescent and I was a very enthusiastic, if not very talented athlete. And I read the biographies and stories of the lives of many of my sports heroes who mainly were African American: Muhammad Ali, um, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Hank Aaron, just to name a boxer, a basketball player, and a baseball player. And reading their life stories um, illustrated to me, what I didn't have the words then, that what white supremacy was. And I think that was a really profound experience as an adolescent. The other that's carried forward a social justice. It laid the foundation for a social justice perspective in my work. The other personal experiences that I've had that have profoundly affected me was I was raised in an evangelical Christian environment. My father was a Pentecostal minister. I grew up in the church and literally living beside the church in a parsonage. And um, my experience with fundamentalist authority and control over everyday life, um, even though I was quite earnest, I was an earnest Christian as a young person. But as I grew up and I started to think about various social issues, I think that experience set me up to develop an anti-authoritarian perspective. It has affected my conceptions of what truth and knowledge and the meaning of education are. Um, and in terms of myself as a student, that's a good question. I would say I went to high school, to secondary school in the 70s, in the early 70s, and I loved it. It was a time of freedom for teachers and for students to explore ideas. It was you know, a time when the counterculture had risen um, into prominence, and it was okay to ask questions, and you were encouraged to ask questions and to pursue um, any interest that you had, really. So my experience as a high schooler was very different from the experience of most students in high schools, and at least in North America today. Um, I like sports. I like the social aspect. And I would say I kind of balanced that with academic curiosity. I was a pretty good student, but I wasn't top of the class. My parents really encouraged me, despite that Christian environment, they really encouraged me to pursue and to get as much education as possible. And one of the really important things in my experience with my parents was that they were not obsessed with my grades. They were more interested in the substance of what I was learning. And we had lots of conversations. I adopted that approach myself. So I think I wasn't striving for grades as much as I was being curious, asking questions, and looking for conversation. And in the end, I think that was what led me into the academic life.
Great. Now we are going to the second question, okay? And I will make a short presentation of the person who made it, and then we go to the question and to your answer. As próximas duas perguntas foram elaboradas pelo professor Júlio César Virgínio da Costa, da Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, onde ele atua no centro pedagógico, né, no programa Promestre da Faculdade de Educação da Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais. Todas elas são referentes ao texto da Conferência da Abertura do 13º Encontro Nacional de Pesquisadores do Ensino de História, que aconteceu em Recife, em 2023, intitulado Desafios e Possibilidades para a Educação Histórica em um Mundo Neoliberal. Diante, the second question, so, diante da degradação das experiências democráticas na atualidade, como muda a importância da educação histórica nas escolas da educação básica?
Yes, that's the degradation of democratic experiences in everyday life. And I think that's also linked to the experiences that students have in schools today. And I think now more than ever, we need an education at all levels, including primary schools, that really focuses less on the transmission of factual content or hegemonic thought, social mores, and more on opportunities for students to see themselves as knowledge creators, that that in their everyday life experience, they create knowledge, they walk into the door with information, knowledge, and experiences that are important. I really believe that the way we understand the world is determined by a combination of things. First of all, what the world is, who we are, and how we conduct our inquiries. So if we want, particularly in primary education, for students to start to build understandings of what the world is and who they are, we need to help them to become situated as within the knowledge construction process. This actually applies to students and to teachers, because when teachers and students sit outside the knowledge construction process, they're situated as passive recipients of maybe prepackaged curriculum, what the textbook says, but also they're passive recipients of major social constructs that govern our lives. And the one that is most important to me is the notion of democracy. So when we have spectator learning, That's how I would describe the passive learning, where learners are spectators in the process. They're just recipients. That feeds into a conception of democracy that is also a spectator democracy. So spectator learning, spectator citizenship are related to one another. And I think schools, by focusing on situating students outside of the knowledge construction process, actually contribute to the notion of a spectator democracy. And just to elaborate on that notion just a little bit, I'm heavily influenced by the political critiques of Noam Chomsky in particular. And he talks about spectator democracy as characterizing our notion of Western liberal democracies, where there are a class of experts that assume that they understand what the common interests are of everyone else, and then they think and plan accordingly. And that leaves people outside of the political realm, making them merely spectators of the political process, at least for most of the time. And individual agency in the political arena then is just reduced to casting your vote. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't outbreaks of collective interest, and we can talk about those later on. But I do believe that when we think about the importance of history education in primary schools or even in secondary schools, the key thing is to get students to see themselves as knowledge creators in interaction with, in conversation with the content that they're reading and the conversations that they're having with their students. I think that's the key thing that history education has to offer.
Okay, the next question will be the three. Okay. A próxima questão também é feita pelo professor Júlio, e ele pergunta da seguinte maneira: professor, o senhor afirma que a desconexão entre a retórica e a realidade da democracia, e igualdade, justiça, direitos, etc., é um desafio direito à forma como conceituamos e ensinamos a cidadania democrática. Como as ideias fascistas e as fake news impactam esse quadro problemático? Pode a educação histórica se inserir na perspectiva a contrapelo? Teríamos algum poder argumentativo contra as redes, ele faz a brincadeira aqui, as redes antissociais?
Well, yes, we do. I think we can have argumentative power against the anti-social media. I think that doesn't mean we're going to overcome, but I think that it is something that we have to see as part of what we're about as history educators, as educators in general. These are really excellent questions, and you can argue that historically, both ideologically and in practice, that what we call democracy, Western liberal democracy, has had a very close association with fascism. At first, I think that might seem counterintuitive, but I talked a little bit about this in the talk I gave to the Brazilian Association of History Teaching, and in the chapter I wrote for the book that came out of the conference. And I'll just kind of go over part of my argument there. If you look at the work of philosophers like and political scientists like Giorgio Agamben, Karl Korsch, of course, they're writing in two different parts of the 20th century, but they both describe a very intimate relationship between what we understand as democracy and fascism. And of course, one of the very earliest thinkers about democracy was Plato, and he didn't have very good things to say about democracy, but he did in a way, kind of predict some of the things that we see today. As Plato predicted that letting people govern themselves would eventually lead to the masses supporting the rule of tyrants. And, I would say that's something that we've seen worldwide in recent years. Now, Agamben points out that democracy really depends, or is defined by, this ambiguity in the way the word is used. On one hand, democracy is the word that we use to describe the power of the people. But the word is also used, the concept is also used as a form of government, the form through which power is legitimated and exercised. So this is how we can have these confusing, seemingly confusing events where the government says they're protecting democracy by suppressing popular sentiment. I mean, that seems like a contradiction. If democracy is the rule of the people, why does government have to suppress speech? Why does government have to pass laws that control people's lives? Why do we have a mass media system that suppresses ideas that are divergent from the ideas of the ruling class? So Agamben points that out. But democracy, as kind of in a broad sense, carries with it bio-class struggle, and it often breaks out. Probably the best examples of this would be the ongoing migrant refugee crisis around the world. I would argue that the current circumstances in Palestine reflect this, that we have these outbreaks of bio-class struggle. And for most people, democracy means a national democracy with a representative democracy with political parties and elections that are rooted in the nation state. But these so-called democracies also have politics and policies that are racist, classist, sexist, heteronormative. They are oppressive in terms of policies around the national security state. We've witnessed for years state violence against citizens, huge wealth inequalities, border regimes, governments exercising control over women's bodies, rolling back civil liberties. And all of this happens in what are considered perfectly acceptable, normal, respectable democracies. For Karl Korsch, he has a little bit of a different view, similar but different view from Agamben. He actually argued that there was no essential difference between what he called bourgeois democracy and fascism. In fact, he said there was an internal connection, that bourgeois democracy has inherently fascist dimensions. And the idea of defending democracy against authoritarian rule really doesn't seem to work. And it never has, really. And we can look at we've got so many recent examples of this. Trump in the United States, Bolsonaro, Duterte in Marcos, Orban in Hungary, Meloni in Italy, Netanyahu in Israel, almost Cast in Chile, the recent victories of the hard right parties in Europe. All of these are fascist oriented, or at least neo-fascist. Fascism, I mean, that's a whole other conversation of, I'm using the word fascism. Probably for some people, I would prefer me to use the word neo-fascism, but I think they're fascist authoritarian results that are produced by what we see as liberal Western democracy. And I believe that history education has a role in the critical examination of the so-called democracies and how they have come to be, how they exist, how they act, the policies that they put forward, and the exposure and the examination of the internal contradictions of liberal democracy, and encouraging, and we have a role as history educators in encouraging the reconceptualization of democracy by asking difficult questions. And I think teaching for democracy in contemporary times really can't be done without engaging in these complexities and contradictions. So some of the key, I don't have an answer, but I have a couple of questions for us as social science and history educators is, can popular democratic politics be created without succumbing to neoliberalism or to authoritarian populism? And how do we approach what's a really massive task? I think those are conversations that we need to have. There are no easy answers on that.
Ok, eu antes de passar para a professora Juliana, quero lembrar para quem está assistindo que o texto do professor Wayne, como também os textos dos outros debatedores, né, participantes de mesa redonda, conferencistas, pode ser acessado na página da ABEH, e nós vamos colocar aqui nos comentários, né, talvez no primeiro comentário, na descrição do vídeo, nós vamos deixar o link, né, para quem quiser acessar o texto e os outros textos também e entrar em contato aí com essa discussão por escrito e outros temas também, né? Então, eu vou passar para a professora Juliana para as perguntas dela.
Hi, Professor Ross. Nice to meet you, sir.
Thank you. Nice to meet you too.
This question formulated by me are based on your research. Let's go to the question number 4. Também gostaria de enfatizar que esse conjunto de perguntas que vão ser estabelecidas para o professor Ross foram baseadas nas na produção dele ao longo desses 30 anos de pesquisa sobre o ensino de ciências sociais e para uma sociedade mais justa, democrática. A pergunta número 4, ela se estabelece do seguinte sentido: como o senhor vê o papel do ensino das ciências sociais em tempos que a gente chama de capitaloceno?
I think of course, there are many roles that social science teaching takes, and of course they're contradictory, many of them. What do I see as the role? That's a big question, and I'm going to try to respond to it in a way that, in a very broad sense, but one that has, I think, lots of application. And I think in some ways it echoes back to the second question. But I see history and social science teachers as history and social science teachers, we should be supporting students to develop personally meaningful understandings of the world. Now, that can be kind of a problematic idea in the sense that when you teach that way, you're trying to help students to create what's meaningful to them. And we might think that those meanings need to be corrected, or they have faults in them. And that's probably true. But I think that if we can teach social sciences and history in ways that allow students to see the relevance to their own understandings and the way in which they make meanings of the world, that then we can help them to and support them in the construction of questions about systems of domination that affect everyday life, including things like capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, heteronormativity. These are systems that are not always recognized. They're deeply embedded in the school curriculum. They're deeply embedded in public discourse. So in a way, what we have to do is we have to help students to be knowledge creators. We have to help them to try to build meaningful understandings, but we also have to introduce to them what I would call ideology critique. Not in a dogmatic way of this is the point of view, but in the way that allows our students to see that ideologies exist, and that particularly those that are dominant and hegemonic within society and that shape our understandings of how things are or how they ought to be, and that oftentimes these hegemonic ideologies are invisible. I asked this question of students, and I think this is a really good pedagogical question. Why are things the way they are? Why are things the way they are? To ask that question is to promote an inquiry into and an analysis of the present, but also a historical conception that, the past contributed to what the present is today. Now, if we can get students to start to think in those ways, and to also to think about, in a future-oriented sense, what ought to be, why are things the way they are, and what ought to be, that those are pedagogically, I think, good questions to support the disruption of hegemonic ideologies that function and shape the world in ways that oftentimes people see as natural. Well, capitalism is just natural. That's the way the world is, rather than as the normative constructions that they are. And then, of course, well, for teachers, we're often taught and we're told that we should be neutral. And you can't be neutral and ask questions like, we can be objective, but we can't be neutral when we ask questions like, why are things the way they are and how should they be? That puts us in a normative process, a normative context. I like this. This is a little example that I also use with students to try to illustrate the invisibility of hegemonic ideologies. And it's a parable that was retold by a writer, David Foster Wallace, when he gave a graduation speech about 20 years ago at a college in the United States. And he recounted this old parable that goes something like this, that there are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to encounter this older fish going the other way. And the old fish says to the young fish, good morning, boys. How is the water? And then the two young fish, they just keep swimming. And then a little bit later, one eventually looks at the other one and says, what the hell is water? And the point, of course, is that the most obvious and important realities are often the ones that are the hardest for us to see and to talk about. So the value of education is not merely the knowledge that is transmitted or created, but there's also the importance of awareness. And I realized that, and I would agree, cognitive psychologist Jerome Bruner said that awareness isn't everything, but without awareness, there's mental and moral death. And so for me, I think making visible the ideologies that shape and control much of our social lives and the ways in which we create understandings of the world is really a key thing for history and social science teachers in times when capitalism, the version of capitalism that we call neoliberalism, is really dominates and shapes the way we actually see the world.
Thank you. Next question, for 5. Dentro desse contexto, professor Ross, o senhor acredita que no ensino de ciências sociais ainda se tem espaço para o debate sobre luta de classes? Esse tema ainda é importante para ser discutido em sala de aula? Como o senhor vê isso?
We have to make the room. We have to make the room for this. Is there room for the class struggle in teaching social sciences? I think most people would say that there's not, because of the control of the curriculum, the governmental control of curriculum, expectations from the public. But this goes back to what I was just saying. We have to make that space. We have to make room for class struggle and many other ideas that the ruling class would rather go unexamined. This includes things, I've mentioned white supremacy, I've mentioned patriarchy, heteronormativity. One of the things that I think is prominent in Canadian schools in particular now is a struggle to include sexuality and sexual health and diversity, gender orientation into the classroom, into the school-wide experience. And if you look at what people who are advocating for queer, trans people, that large collection of diverse people who don't fit into the box of heterosexuality and cisgender orientation, that this is a political struggle that requires clarity, political clarity, and it requires organization and action. And I think that in terms of class struggle, I don't separate that from the struggle for sexual freedom and many other struggles. They're there. And I think that we need that, in particular, from thinking about class struggle in the economic sense, is closely related to the struggle for what I don't have the word for real democracy, or the power of the people, in a Marxian sense, that where people's daily lives aren't ruled by the financialization of the economy, that we have a real economy. So if you look closely at the teaching of democracy and political participation in schools, you're going to see the conceptions of learning in democracies, like this is kind of a repeat of what I said earlier, that cast learners as passive, the democratic citizenship as a spectator project. And all of this results in status quo, social, political, and economic inequalities. So, but to teach in ways that center class struggle and resistance to capitalist and other hegemonic worldviews often puts teachers, professors, in dangerous situations. So we have to be aware of that. That's why the courage and clarity and organization to teach against the grain is necessary. But, a good starting point for this kind of teaching is to initiate students into a social life that I would say is characteristic of democracy as the power of the people, and that is a community of full participation. And if we start with a community of full participation, and we ask these kinds of questions that I was talking about before, why are things the way they are, and what ought to be, then I think we can start to create that kind of dynamic space for class struggle to be at the center of what we do in social science teaching.
Thank you, Professor Ross. Next, 6. Next question 6. Como o senhor tem visto esse movimento neoliberal de dominação dos corpos a partir da chamada educação socioemocional? Esse é o projeto mais eficaz do neoliberalismo de romper definitivamente com a possibilidade da escola formar cidadãos críticos, mobilizados e participativos?
That's a really interesting observation and question. And I think it's often, I think we can link that with the invisible ways that neoliberalism functions and how we literally embody it. Neoliberalism denies society. It denies collective interests. And it constructs this image of the world that is disconnected, autonomous individuals who have to be self-regulating. So the problems that individuals experience, we are told, are the result of individual choices. And at the risk of repeating myself, this is a denial of the big picture or the existence of these dominating systems such as capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, etc. And we can see how this is embodied in what many people call the quantified self, that we have to operate our lives in relation to a neoliberal frame. And I'll give an example, a personal example that's maybe a little detached from social emotional education, but it's kind of the same, I think has the same qualities. I've been a lifelong runner and marathoner. And so I have a GPS watch, that I wear, and I go out for a run, and it tells me what my heart rate is, gives me information on my gait, on the length of my stride, besides telling me how far I ran, how fast I ran, et cetera, et cetera. And it graphs all of this stuff out, and it presents an image of what I'm supposed to be striving for, what I'm supposed to be doing. And I find that information useful, but it does create a situation like when my battery dies when I'm running, or if I go out on a run and I forget to put my watch on. Oftentimes I have this experience of thinking that maybe that experience that I just had didn't happen, or it doesn't count because I don't have the information that I thought was going to be, that I expected to be generated. And I think that things like social emotional education operate in the similarity is that it is based on this controlling, making us think as individuals that we have to structure our lives in relation to some data or an image of what is a good runner, what is a good student, what is a good human being. What is that image that we're trying to achieve? It's like, in many ways, we're witnessing the ascendancy of neoliberalism that's produced this homogenizing, assimilationist tendencies that affect learning and teaching. They affect our research and our daily life. They profoundly affect the character of our daily life. And again, for the most part, I think these kinds of individualized frameworks for understanding the world take us away from a critical, mobilized, and participatory sense of ourselves as citizens, but also collectively, who we are collectively. And it draws a very small circle around us. It makes us think that if we are having problems or if we're experiencing difficulties, that it's a function of a deficit within us and has no relation to the larger world. This is a principle that we need to break down. I believe philosophically that that there is a society, that we do have collective and shared interests, despite the individualism that is at the heart of so many aspects of our daily life in neoliberal times. And social emotional education, I think, is an example that's a popular idea that's embedded within the curriculum that only it doesn't have there is some critique of this, but not the level of critique that I think we need to have. It's one example among many.
A última questão, question 7. Professor Ross, como a disciplina de estudos sociais pode ajudar as crianças e os jovens a projetarem outros futuros em alternativa ao projeto de futuro proposto pelo neoliberalismo?
Yes, yeah, it's a good question, and it's a good one to follow up the last couple.
Question 7.
Yes.
Repeat.
I think that
I understand.
The aim of education in general should not be merely preparation for life. That really, what I tell many of my students, my teacher education students, that we shouldn't be trying to show life to people. We should not be about showing life to people. We need to bring them to life. So the aim should be, our pedagogical aim should be getting students to speak for themselves, or at least to try to speak for themselves, and to achieve a level of equality and participation in learning and life. It's only through, to me, I think that is really the only way in which we can start to construct possible futures. This goes back to my question of, why are things the way they are, and what ought to be. If we can teach in this way, then this will lead us, and if students learn in these ways, this will lead us towards an alternative future. But it's not an easy path. Going below the surface to discover that things aren't as self-evident as we might have thought they were presents a challenge. And as I mentioned before, it can be dangerous. I've talked about this in a concept that I have written about for years and that I developed with my colleague Kevin Vinson, which we call dangerous citizenship. And what the point of this idea is to try to get try to communicate to students and to others that when you work against the status quo, when you teach against the grain, you're engaged in a dangerous activity, one that has it's a double-edged sword. When you take action against social inequalities, you're challenging. When you act, I'll put it in a positive term. When you act in a social justice-oriented way, you're dangerous to the status quo. But the actions that you take in challenging the status quo will put you in potentially in some kind of danger, in some kind of harm's way. Just briefly, the idea of dangerous citizenship, really it's just four premises, basically, that democracy and capitalism, democracy is rule of the people, and capitalism are not compatible, they're incompatible. That teachers and curriculum and schooling have been subjected to intensified policy regimes that attack academic freedom and they discourage critical thought. That most schools are capitalist schools, and they're aimed at social control, at winning over students to be loyal and obedient and dutiful and useful to the dominant systems that exist. And that civil disobedience is not our problem. Our problem is we have too much civil obedience. And we have to overcome that if we want to transform education and society. So the challenge is discovering what kinds of pedagogies we can employ in support of dangerous citizenship. And I think that this kind of teaching demands the creation of learning opportunities that are driven by students and their interests. Their experiences that provoke questions, experiences that bring up multiple perspectives and that encourage skepticism, but that also instigate human connection, true engagement with everyday life, meaningful experiences, meaningful from the sensibilities of students, that they also instigate communication and change. That, like, I really believe that if we investigate a social issue or a social problem and we bring this stance, this intellectual stance to that investigation, that we contribute to the process of social change. So teaching for dangerous citizenship really involves identifying the underlying assumptions that govern our everyday life and our everyday life practices, and asking questions of those assumptions. And I was really inspired by this. Kevin Vinson and I both were very inspired by this a number of years ago when we started to read about post-left anarchism and started to look at the public pedagogy of political artists, performance artists, visual artists. And I think that these sources that are kind of outside the box of pedagogical or educational literature can serve as really powerful imaginaries for a pedagogy of a political pedagogy, one that I describe as dangerous citizenship. I'll just mention a couple of examples. and I've written about these. And so if you're interested, you can probably, you can find some sources on this, but I really like Hakeem Bey's idea of temporary autonomous zones. And I encourage teachers to think about their classrooms as temporary autonomous zones, where the idea there is that you don't try to lead a revolution and transform every aspect of your classroom, but you look for the spaces where unique and different kinds of experiences can be created without confronting authority. There are little pop-up zones of freedom to teach, freedom to Zoom. We have, you have a pop-up store that shows up. It's not the permanent store. Let's have some pop-up freedom classrooms. That's my idea of bringing temporary autonomous zones into schools. Or I'm very much influenced and inspired by the situationists, Guy Debord and the group of situationists that were active in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s. Debord wrote the book Society of the Spectacle. And one of the strategies that they developed was called détournement. And that literally was about taking a piece of visual art and then reconstructing it, remixing it, we would say now, and to use it to send a message that is the antithesis of the message sent by the original artwork, or at least one that remixes that message. So what are the ways? One of the things that I do with my students is I say, let's look at the textbooks that you're using to teach the content, and what are the ways in which you can perform a détournement and use the text, but to teach for a different outcome than the one that's intended in the textbook. There's lots of other examples of that. And then one other idea that I like is Bertolt Brecht's notion of the alienation effect. And that's a little more difficult to explain in a quick way, but basically Brecht's work in theater challenged the notion of a passive audience who were encouraged in the theater, were encouraged to relate to the main characters in the plot of the play. And he wanted what he called epic theater. He wanted to disrupt that passive role of the audience and to implicate them into the narrative. And I think that translates well into social science and history teaching, because we have these narratives that really encourage our students to think about the political actors in that narrative and to relate to them. But how can we disrupt that? How can we create that alienation from the narrative in a way that shocks the students into and implicates them in the narrative so that they cannot be passive recipients? They have to see themselves as implicated in whatever the narrative is. So I think seeking and creating, conditions in which students can develop these personally meaningful understandings of the world and recognize that they have agency and that they can make change. That these are just some examples of pathways that we can take to accomplish that. And I hope that makes some sense in relation to the question about how we can help students to think about and to project other possible futures. We have to create we can't tell them what the possible futures are. Well, we can, but that's not going to be effective. They need to create their own possible futures, and it needs to come from personally meaningful understandings that they have of the world. And I think we need to have tolerance as professors and teachers for visions of the future that are not synonymous with our own. And that when there is conflict between different visions, those are the places where we need to have dialogue and discourse. And that's where we're really going to start to see the construction of meanings and real possible futures in those dialogues. Sorry for that long response.
No, teacher, professor, it was so good. First of all, on behalf of our members and our associates, I would like to thank you for accepting our invitation to this event. It's an honor to have you here with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I will present you the question 8, formulated by me. Em seu livro, Rethink Social Studies, publicado em 2017, o senhor discorre sobre a importância em considerar o dia a dia das escolas, particularmente o dia a dia da sala de aula, como um elemento crucial para um ensino de história efetivamente transformador da realidade social. Like you are speaking about in the other questions, yeah? O senhor também chama atenção para a invisibilidade da sala de aula nas pesquisas em estudos sociais. Além disso, nesse livro, o senhor apresenta uma questão interessante. Como ensinar mantendo nossos ideais em uma era caracterizada por um currículo fechado, sistemas de responsabilização e objetivos educacionais regidos pelas leis de mercado? O senhor poderia abordar de forma resumida essa questão para que possamos conhecer um pouco do conteúdo desse livro?
I'll try. Excuse me.
This question about the results is so...
I'll tell just a little story.
Okay.
Many years ago, when I was teaching university in New York, I had a student. Well, I was in it was at the end of the term, and the students had done their practicum and they had come back and we were debriefing. And one of the students raised this question about her experience. Her name was Pam. And she said, I just spent all these months doing my practice teaching, and I saw all of these teachers, including my colleagues, and she pointed to her colleagues, who said, these are my ideas, this is what I want to be as a teacher, but their ideas were not implemented in practice. And everyone had an excuse for why they were teaching the way they were teaching, and for the misalignment between what they claimed to be their aim and what they actually did. And she says, I think people, teachers, they all say that I'm going to teach the way I want to teach once I get my own classroom. And then once they get their classroom, then they say, well, I'm going to teach the way I want to teach once I get tenure and job protection. And she says, the only thing I can figure is that by the time you get your own classroom and you get tenure, that you forgot why it was you wanted to teach. And that's a great example, I think, of, I mentioned that I studied psychology when I first started university. And actually, in my mentor teacher in social studies education, whose name was Richard C. Phillips, he was fantastic. He was not a fantastic teacher, but he was a fantastic thinker and theorist. And he really highlighted to me the importance of the work of a social psychologist named Leon Fetstinger. And Fetstinger developed the theory of cognitive dissonance. And I think what Pam described was exactly that. Fetstinger talked about cognitive dissonance. He described it as a mental disturbance people feel when their beliefs and their actions are inconsistent or contradictory. And this dissonance ultimately encourages people to either change their beliefs or change their actions in order to reduce the dissonance. And I think there are lots of teachers out there, lots of professors too, lots of people in all walks of life who really do have authentic beliefs that are inconsistent or contradictory with the context in which they're working or teaching or living their lives. And one of the things that I really talk about a lot with beginning teachers is I warn them. I say, don't, if you want to keep your ideals and still teach. And I say that this is really important, because if you can't keep your ideals and you continue to teach, you set yourself up to experience alienation from yourself, alienation from your work, your students, whatever. And alienation is not something that we want to encourage. It's not something that you want to experience. So I tell them that, people use all these kinds of social strategies to cope and to struggle with workplace situations. And many of them choose to comply with institutional demands, and they adopt the beliefs that constrain and the constraints of the situations as just being, I don't know what else to do. I just have to accept the way things are. I call that internalized adjustment. It's like when you have these beliefs and values that are misaligned or contradictory with the workplace that you're in, and you say, well, I'm going to resolve this by I'm going to jettison my ideals and I'm going to accept the institution's ideals. And I beg my students not to do that. I say, you're going to feel pressure to do this. It's the desire for approval from the institution, the desire of approval from your coworkers and your principal and the teachers in the community. You need to resist that. Because uncritical assimilation of institutional beliefs is really, it's threatening, and it's going to lead to dissatisfaction. So what I encourage people to do is this. You need to engage in what I describe as strategic compliance. So if you want to keep your ideals and still teach, well, first of all, you have to understand what your ideals are. And we do a lot to work through that. What are my core beliefs? What is my my worldview, or what is my stance as a teacher? You have to have clarity about that. And then you have to think about, okay, if there are places where your ideals and the demands of your job are in contradiction with one another, what are the ways in which you can strategically comply with what's demanded by the institution? But how can you create spaces where you can fulfill the ideals that motivated you to teach in the first place? Now, this goes back to what I just was talking about in the previous question, the idea of temporary autonomous zones in particular. So what is it that you need to do to work within the system, but maybe sustain an oppositional stance to certain kinds of things that the system wants you to do? One of the things that I tell my students, they don't like to hear this, but I tell them it's better. I'll talk about my educational experience in university. One of the courses that I took to fulfill my science requirement was astronomy. And I really like that. So I use this astronomy metaphor with them. I tell them it's better to be like a super giant star than a white dwarf star. But a super giant star basically lives fast, dies young, and it detonates in a supernova. And a white dwarf star is a star that used to be hot, but it's run out of fuel, and now it lacks the massive force to create a fusion reaction. And I tell them that there's a lot of teachers out there that are like white dwarf stars. They were once hot, now they're cold. They don't have energy, they don't have fuel. They're just going through the motions. But one of the things I've learned is that not many students want to think of themselves as a detonating supergiant star. But I do tell them that I really believe that if staying true to yourself requires that, then that's okay. And then maybe finding the right context to teach, or maybe doing like me and becoming a professor. Maybe that's a route to go too. But there are ways to work within the system. Now, I can't tell you in a recipe about that because it requires awareness, it requires political clarity, it requires organization, it requires social connection and organization with others who share the same ideals that you do in order to survive. Now, of course, ultimately, there is a third route to go, and that is strategic redefinition. And that third way is like revolutionary. That's a revolution. It's like transforming the school experience. And ultimately, that's where we should be going, I think. But I think if it's difficult for people to see how massive institutions like the industry of education, but public schools, it's difficult for them to see how all of that can be transformed. So I try to encourage them to think about everyday life situations, to think about the areas that they can control. And if we have teachers, a lot of teachers engaged in strategic compliance, and if they are organizing and having dialogues about the kinds of things that we're doing, I think then we're on a pathway that could potentially lead us to strategic redefinition of the purposes and aims of schools. And I know it's a bumper sticker truism, but the idea that never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, that's the only thing that ever has. Now, I know that that's a little bumper sticker idea, but I think that's the pathway that we have to choose if we want to keep our ideals and still teach.
Thank you, Professor. I so agree with you. Now, we have the question 9 formulated by Professor Serri. No Brasil, estão em estágio avançado os projetos de militarização e privatização das escolas públicas em alguns estados. O que a experiência estadunidense, norte-americana, tem a nos dizer para o enfrentamento dessa tendência?
It's a massive project. It's one that requires resistance. It requires courage to confront. I think that for me personally, based on what I know, that some of the best models for how to confront anti-democratic trends within public schools, including privatization, militarization, the invisible hegemonies that are built into the narratives of the curriculum, come from Mexico. That the democratic strain of teachers in Mexico, I think, have really shown how collective resistance can work. Not that democratic teachers in Mexico have transformed that system, but they have demonstrated a lot of courage. Particularly, I'm thinking about in the late 90s and in the 2000s, when the government of Mexico took action to destroy the rural normal schools that were preparing teachers to teach in the rural areas, particularly in southern Mexico. But in North America, this is a struggle that has been going on as neoliberal education policies develop, particularly in coming out of from Reagan, the presidency of Ronald Reagan, ramping up through Clinton in the 90s, and then also including George Bush and the Obama administration. In particular, all of them, Republicans and Democrats both, have produced education policies that were totally on side with neoliberalism. We see the same thing in terms of worldwide policies with OECD. But my own personal experiences in North America, and I'm not putting these up as ideals, but just the activities that I've been involved with cut across a number of different areas. I worked in, co-founded a group called the Rouge Forum, which was a grassroots group that included history and social science teachers, literacy teachers, and special education teachers. And we organized, and we weren't a super large group, but we were spread across the United States and Canada. And tried to create a community that was supportive of one another in a big tent sense in terms of politics. The Rouge Forum included people that I would describe as political liberals, as well as people who were influenced by Marxism, who had Marxist politics or communist politics, as well as people that were anarchists of various kinds. And so the Rouge Forum was unique in that sense. And it did give us the opportunity to have deep discussions to see where we could work together, and to also broaden our horizons a bit in terms of the ideologies and the politics that we were committed to. It was very participatory and grassroots. Now, in Canada, in the last couple of decades, I've been involved in some groups and some organizing that look a little different from this. There was I was involved in the creation of the Institute for Public Education, British Columbia, which kind of works as a think tank model. It tries to bring together scholars and education leaders to provide commentary on policies and government actions and school actions that's informed from a research perspective. That's a very different model from kind of the grassroots activism model of the Rouge Forum. And it's in the IPE BC, the Institute for Public Education BC, has been successful in bringing in kind of broadening the discourse on education issues in our province of British Columbia, which is on the west coast of Canada, just north of the US state of Washington. A third experience that I've had is with a group called the Institute for Critical Education Studies. And basically what we have done in the Institute for Critical Education Studies is it's a little different from both the Rouge Forum and IPE in that we sponsor 2 academic journals. One's called Critical Education. You can find it by going to criticaleducation.org. And the other journal is called Workplace, a journal for academic labor. Now, those are 2 scholarly journals. Critical Education is a Scopus index journal. Workplace is indexed in many places. It's not indexed in Scopus, but in many other places. And both of those journals, what we're trying to do there is to create space for research and ideas and practices that perhaps wouldn't be seen as appropriate in more mainstream journals. I'm not saying that critical education is not mainstream, but it embraces a wide diversity of critical social science informed research and education. There's a third group that I've been less centrally involved in that is fairly new, and it's called the Public Education Exchange in Canada, or here it goes by PEX. And what the Public Education Exchange is doing is really trying to organize, push back against privatization of public education in various provinces, particularly in Ontario, which is the largest province in population-wise in Canada, and in Manitoba, which is in central Canada, and also Alberta. PEX is relatively new, but if you go to the journal Critical Education, you'll see that the current issue is research that's been produced by people that are part of the Public Education Exchange, and doing research and analysis on privatization in Canada, looking at things like the ideological motivations, the provincial privatization schemes, that is how various provincial governments are introducing privatization through things like US-style charter schools and other ways. And also, and very importantly, promoting the resistance and putting a narrative to the resistance movement against the privatization of public schools. So those are 4 examples that I think are worth taking a look at in terms of how people are confronting the trends towards privatization. I've written about the Rouge Forum with some of my Rouge Forum colleagues, and we had an article in a journal that is called the Journal for Critical Education Policy Studies, which is published in England. There's also a journal article about the Rouge Forum that is from a number of years ago, that's in the IPE journal that I mentioned, Workplace, a journal for academic labor. So I've written about those. The ISIS, and that is the Institute for Critical Education Studies, and the Institute for Public Education BC, both have their own websites, and you could find those in Google.
Thank you, Professor. I will make the last question. Then I made some notes here at the question group. The question 10.
Yes.
Para finalizar, sabemos da importância da articulação social e política dos pesquisadores da nossa área com outras entidades e com a população em geral. You said about Rouge Forum before. Yeah, I will ask you about it again.
I can talk a little.
Okay.
Okay, I can talk a little bit more about it. It it has an interesting origin story. And
okay.
that the Rouge Forum began at the largest convention for history and social science teachers in the United States. It's called the National Council for the Social Studies, back in 1994. And a social studies teacher who's from California, his name is Sam Diener, was arrested at the convention for passing out leaflets that criticized the militarization of schools. And his arrest was instigated by the teachers' organization, the National Council for Social Studies, NCSS.org. No, socialstudies.org is their website. But that Sam Diener was a teacher who was also a pacifist, and he worked for the War Resisters League and the Central Committee of Conscientious Objectors. And there was a small group of social studies educators, including me, who rallied around Sam and to support him. Actually, the article that I mentioned before about the Rouge Forum that was published in Workplace, we tell this whole story. It's actually quite an interesting story. We created an emergency group that tried to work in Sam's favor, and also tried to get the National Council for the Social Studies to drop the charges, and we made some other demands. We ended up having a meeting in Detroit, Michigan, in the United States, at Wayne State University, where a number of social studies teachers came to discuss, okay, what do we need to do? And maybe we need to develop an alternative organization. And we were joined there by some literacy educators and some special educators. And we did not have a name for the group, but the Rouge Forum was actually named after a river that runs through the city of Detroit called the River Rouge. And you can find out more about that if you go to rougeforum.org. It's one of the websites, or rougeforumconferences.org, where there's an archive of many of our meetings and et cetera. So, but anyway, we've brought these groups together: literacy educators, special educators, history and social science educators. And we had a number, we were very active at a national level with national meetings through 2017, 2018. But in a way, well, I'll hold off on that comment. I would describe us as activist oriented, scholarly oriented, and also as a community. So we tried to do the kinds of things to support one another in terms of our strategic compliance or attempts of resistance. There were members of the group that engaged in direct action at various kinds of teacher conferences. I would call it the creative disruption of everyday life, and also took direct action in terms of demonstrations and protests around various repressive education policies in different states, particularly in Michigan and California, in New York. The Rouge Forum was very involved in the resistance to high stakes testing in the United States, especially in the 90s and 2000s, where states were using examinations to state examinations to make judgments about kids and whether or not they could graduate or move from one grade level to the next. So the high stakes testing movement in the United States was a key focus of the Rouge Forum. It wasn't the only focus, but it was a key focus. So we probably held upwards of 30 meetings across the years from the late 90s until about 2017, 2018. And we published a zine, like a magazine that was called the Rouge Forum News, and that we distributed through our grassroots networks. And we also did things like we gave panels and workshops at teachers' conferences. So we would organize to go to a state level history or social studies teacher conference. And we would basically do a workshop, oftentimes that was kind of described in terms of its intent to support and encourage resistance to high stakes testing. So we worked in kind of a subversive way. We strategically complied in many ways by doing what was necessary in order to get onto programs at state level and even national conferences. We pushed our own professional organizations to adopt statements or statements of policy or resolutions that were against high stakes testing, as well as anti-war, anti-military positions, that is working within social studies, literacy, and special education groups to try to push back against those organizations, to get them to take stances on testing and privatization and militarization of schools particularly in the United States. So the Rouge Forum was never really organized as a formal group. We had a steering committee, and we basically financed our activities based on personal donations of the people on the steering committee, and by using school and university copy machines to create our zine, and kind of by hook or crook. If we weren't, the Rouge Forum could have probably used a more Leninist leadership than we had in terms of organizing the group. But I think we had a great deal of impact, including presenting. At one point, we had the largest research group and educational research group in the United States is the American Educational Research Association. And in 2000 or 2001, we actually did a workshop panel at the AERA convention that was endorsed by the president of the organization. So I do think we had some profile and some success at local levels at trying to affect the discourse particularly around high stakes testing. I personally published probably close to 100 letters or op-ed pieces for newspapers in the United States, or professional journals that were about the work of the Rouge Forum or around issues that the Rouge Forum was working on. So that's a sample of what the Rouge Forum was about. It was a kind of a non-organization organization that brought many anarchist principles into play. That is, trying to be subversive, trying to disrupt normal discourse, taking direct action, but doing it from oftentimes from activating knowledge that we had as scholars about the impact of the privatization of schools or the impact of high stakes testing on student learning. So sorry I went on a little bit about that, but that's, I think, taking a look at some of the articles that we've written about the Rouge Forum could be informative and helpful in terms of thinking about ways to organize resistance to militarization and the privatization of schools in Brazil and other places.
Thank you. It's so wonderful. It's so good to have another experience to think about it. I would like to thank you, and I will give Serri the important action to enclosure our meeting.
Well, Wayne, thank you a lot for your answers. You made us think a lot and have some dangerous ideas. We hope we meet in person in a short time to taste some Brazilian meal as feijoada or a Brazilian barbecue.
Yes, definitely.
We hope we meet. Okay.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me. And please feel free to edit what I said, because I know sometimes I went a little long.
No, that's perfect.
Teacher,
that's perfect.
I hope one day in Recife.
That would be wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
E obrigado a todos pela assistência. Entrem em contato com a associação, vejam o livro que tem o texto do professor Wayne e nos vemos em seguida. Muito obrigado e até logo.
Bye-bye.
Bye.